I believe we're live, and so I want to welcome you tonight to Journey, and tonight we're part 2 of our grief, a natural part of God's design, 3-part series. He's condensed basically 13 weeks of what he normally teaches down into just 3, so you're getting the cream of the crop of the essence of what he teaches about this, and something we all need to know, because either you're going to walk through a season of grief yourself, and it's helpful to know what that process looks like and what to expect, and you're also going to come in contact with people who are walking through a time of grief, and it's very helpful that you know how to be a comforter, and you do things and make decisions that are going to be helpful for those going through a time, which, as we heard last time, the main thing is just be there, be present, and grieve with them. So appreciate you being here tonight. If we're trying to help people hear about these services, these ministries we provide, so feel free either now or after the service, if you're on Facebook or whatever, feel free to share this. I know a lot of people would be helped by this message in particular on grief, and so feel free to share that. That's going to be very helpful. As we mentioned Sunday, we've had people show up after COVID simply because they saw something going on online, and so that's actually a ministry, good outreach opportunity for all of us. But let's go to Lord in prayer, and then Brother Gale Lawler, for those of you who might not know him, watching or here tonight, he's going to come and share with us tonight. And so let's go to Lord in prayer, and we'll continue with our message tonight. Gracious Father, thank you for your love and your mercy. And Father, I just want to pray for those right now who they are listening online. They are here tonight because they are walking through grief right now, and they lost someone they loved, and maybe the days after that were a bit of a whirlwind, but then as it got quiet, as life continued to move on, grief really began to set in. And so, Father, pray tonight and last week and next week would be helpful for them, be encouraging for them, be of comfort to them. And we know that knowledge is helpful, but our presence is helpful. When we sit with those who grieve, we bear witness to their suffering and to the suffering of Christ. And so, Father, pray your blessing over Brother Gale tonight as he comes and shares with us. May you use his words to equip us and to comfort us as well. And just thankful for his story and that he's been so willing to share with us tonight. It's been helpful tonight and last week and the week to come. It's been so helpful for us. So thank you for your love and your mercy. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Good evening. We're going to continue on. Last week we talked about what happens during the initial phase of grief after a loved one passes. And now we're going to talk about what happens between that time and when they finish their grief journey, as I call it. I facilitate a group called Grief Share, and they call it the journey from mourning to joy. So during this journey, we're going to be talking about what happens. And I'll be talking about different aspects. They're in no particular order. It's just what happens, so I'll be jumping around from one to the other. That's the way I do it. Most of the people that come to Grief Share come because they've lost a spouse. That is the biggest loss that we see in Grief Share. So my comments tonight will be from the loss of a spouse. That's not to put down the loss of a brother or a sister or a mother or father or aunt or a child. Those are all special, but I'll be talking from the loss of a spouse, and that can be relayed to those other kind of losses as well. The first thing I want to talk about is the factors that affect grief, whether you grieve heavy or you grieve light. One of the factors is the natural order by age. If the person is a grandparent, that's kind of expected. That's a natural order. And next are the parents. Those are heavier griefs. And then your siblings. That gets real close. And then if you lose a child, That is completely out of the natural order because they're younger, and those tend to be some of the hardest grief cases that we have and have many more issues than I can even tap into. There's special counselors, there's special sessions for when you're grieving losing a child. That's separate. And then out of that natural progression through age, your spouse is different from all the others. And that's because you have been joined together in marriage. You and your spouse have become one. And when your spouse dies, it's like ripping you apart. So losing a spouse is much harder than losing a brother or a sister or a parent. Losing a spouse is like losing half of yourself. So that's why I'm going to talk about it, and that's the perspective I have. The other factors that affect the amount of grief and the duration and the intensity is the cause of death. A long-term illness is probably the easiest because you get to do a lot of grieving as the illness progresses. A short-term illness is the next. And then in sudden death, there's different factors. If it's natural, like a stroke or a heart attack, Janie died with a massive stroke, so it was fairly quick, unexpected, in a matter of hours, everything happened. It wasn't drawn out over days, it was hours. The next is like an accident, a car collision. The next harder one would be a disaster where many people die, like the explosion that happened in West Texas a few years ago. And then we get to the tragic ones. I say tragic because they are really tragic. It's things like murder. The next is drugs, abuse of drugs. Because that has the person that's dying partially responsible or fully responsible for their own death. And then the last is suicide. If your loved one committed suicide, you probably have a very, very difficult time of grieving, partially because people won't come alongside you and support you and help you through that grief process, because suicide is such a stigma in our culture. We've had 2 people in grief share groups since I started that their loved ones had committed suicide. Both of them were siblings. And they had a hard time because no one wanted to come alongside them and talk about it and help with their recovery and be there for support because of the stigma. So those are the factors that affect how we grieve and how we get support for our loss. So how do we help? We understand that everyone is grieving differently and for different reasons. Some take much, much longer. Some grief periods are very short, and that may be because they've been grieving for years before the actual death occurred. I will mention there's a man that was in our group whose wife had been basically bedridden for 8 years before she passed away. And his grief process was only a matter of about 3 months because he had been grieving for years, and it was kind of a relief to wrap it up and be finished. And he was able to move on with his life. Don't minimize a person's grief because they may have lost a grandmother or grandfather. Sometimes those relationships with grandparents is very tight, and if you lose a grandparent, it can be a very traumatic grief, especially if the person's younger and they lost a grandparent and they may be teenagers or early 20s and they lose a grandparent because they've had a real tight relationship with them. And don't shun someone because their loved one did drugs or committed suicide. they're hurting just as much as anyone else. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is, who are you now? After you've lost your loved one, after you've lost your spouse, who are you now? When you lose a loved one, a married person becomes single again. Parents may become childless again, which is a huge thing. A sibling may become an only child. Your status changes. You need to establish a new identity. The death of a loved one changes your status. I know that right after Janie passed away, it may have been 3 or 4 weeks, I had to go see a new doctor over in Killeen. So I was a new patient, so I sat in and I filled in the form, and I sat there with tears coming down my face, having to check the box for widower, because that was my new status, and I didn't want that status, but that's who I was. So your status in life changes, and you don't like it necessarily. In fact, you don't like it at all. But then we need to remember that the loss of a loved one is something that happens to you, but it doesn't define you. Okay? My status may be widower, but that doesn't define who Gale Lawler is. That's just one of the many things, many aspects, or many facets of who I am. It doesn't define who I am. So you have to establish your own identity again. You have to figure out who you are. Now then, if you've only been married for 3 or 4 years and you lose your spouse, that's tragic, yes. But it may be easier for you to revert back to who you were before you got married, because you're still approximately the same age and would have the same interest, and you can become who you were again. However, if you're like me and you've had a long marriage, we had 37 years of marriage, thank God. I didn't remember, and I didn't particularly like who I was back when I was in my late 20s. And I surely didn't want to go back to doing the things I was doing then, dating and the whole scene. No, that wasn't who I wanted to be. So I had to figure out who Gale Lawler was. And we have to ask our questions, who are we now? What do we like to do? Well, I was still active in church, so I just increased that activity. I like to quilt, so I increased that activity. I had enough things that I was doing that I just increased those. Now then, Janie and I did a lot of things together. We were together all the time. But when I was quilting, I'd be sitting at a table with my sewing machine and pattern and whatever, and I was sewing stuff together. She had a table right behind me, or in front of me over there, and she was doing jigsaw puzzles all the day and talking to her pieces of jigsaw puzzles. It was cute. We spent the day together. We were doing different activities, but we spent the day together. So after she passed, I could continue quilting. That's what I liked to do, and that was part of who I was by choice. Okay? Then we have to ask ourselves, where do we want to be? Okay? I'm perfectly happy to live out in the middle of a cornfield. That's where I really want to be. Okay? Some people decide that they want to go back to their family because their family is out of state, they were raised out of state. So after a while, they decide they really want to go back to get closer to family. So you have to figure out where you want to be. You have to ask what your interests are. And you really have to take a good inventory. Then you have to ask yourself things like, This is a cute one. What do you like to eat? Sometimes when you're married, you eat things because of your spouse. I'm going to tell a story about my father-in-law and mother-in-law, okay? Paul and Audrey Butler. Some of you old folks in here may remember them. They were here a few years before Audrey passed away about 10 years ago. And then about 6 years ago, my father-in-law, Paul Butler, passed away. Well, after Audrey had passed away, Janie and I kept taking her dad out to get a Subway sandwich because that's what he liked for lunch, especially after church. We'd go over and get a Subway sandwich. Well, all his life, Audrey had been ordering the sandwiches, and all he had ever had was a veggie sandwich. And that lasted about 6 months until I said, Hall, are you sure you don't want to put some meat on there? He said, meat? It was like a kid in a candy store. He changed his eating habits because he could now make his own decisions. So he changed from veggie sandwich. He had every kind of meat there. Every week it was like we had to go get a Subway sandwich because he was trying something new. So he figured out what he liked to eat after his wife passed away. Then we have to ask ourselves, what kind of pets do we like? And this is my own personal one. Janie loved cats. Okay? We had other pets. We had dogs. I love dogs. We had ferrets. I hate ferrets. We had guinea pigs. I hate guinea pigs. We had cats. I'll tolerate cats. At one time, we had 8 indoor cats. And Janie took very good care to keep the house clean, and the cats had their own room for litter boxes and food, and you could walk in our house and never smell a cat, okay? People would come in and visit the first time and see a cat go, and they said, oh, you have cats? I didn't notice. And she took care of them. After she passed away, we were down to 1 cat, and he was my buddy. And had been my buddy. The only cat we had ever had that liked me more than Janie. And he was the only one left at that time. So he stayed around about a year before he got really old, and I had to have him put down. And we became buddies. I will never have another cat in my house. I might have a dog someday. I doubt it. But I will never have another cat in my house. I have to figure that out myself. Also, some of your interests may change. Some of the things that you really like to do together may not be fun anymore, like watching television. I have not turned on the television in our house since Janie passed away, except to watch a Christmas movie when the kids are home at Christmas. Okay? Cruising. Janie and I went on a number of cruises and thoroughly loved it. I've been on 3 cruises since that time, and I took somebody with me each time. My brother and I went together, I think 2 cruises. My brother and I went together one time, and Travis Ridgway, I think I mentioned that young man, was like a son to me. He and I went on a cruise with James and Donnie Martin, my neighbors, one time. But it's no fun without Janie. We love to travel. Now, I do love a road trip, and I still go on road trips, and that's for me because that's my interest. Janie loved road trips too, but I still find them pleasurable. Okay? Things that you enjoyed before you got married, you may want to go back and pick those up. Some people used to play a musical instrument, then got married, dropped it because family came along, got busy, and now later in life, they go back and pick up the musical instrument again. And it takes quite a while, maybe years, before you figure out who you really are and what you really enjoy and what you can let go of and let go by the wayside. And how can we help? Don't be surprised when the person is changed. Don't be surprised when they dress in different clothes. Don't be surprised if they change from an introvert to an extrovert or vice versa. Don't be surprised if they change from a night person to a morning person. They're settling into who they are. And that's important. Just encourage them and accept them. The next thing that we notice is that friends may change. Older, long-term friendships will probably stay the same. But friends that you made as a couple in the last 10 years will probably go by the wayside. And that's because social dynamics change. You can go out as 4 people to dinner, but 3 people is awkward. 3 people says there's 2 guys and a lady or 2 ladies and a guy, and the social dynamics are mixed up and they're uncomfortable. You may have some jealousy. You may have, if I went out with a couple, I may have a lot in common with a guy and very little with a woman, and she might feel left out of this interaction. So those friendships will die away. They did with me. Up until the time Jenny died, we had been going out with a lot of couples and couples too on a monthly basis and having dinner with somebody and doing that. That came to a complete stop when she died. I was invited one time to go to dinner with a couple after Jenny passed. And that was with my cousins, Ed and Wilva Dorsey. I was never asked to go out with a couple to have dinner like we had been. And that's just because the social dynamics aren't there. I'm not upset about it. I just recognize that it happens and it will happen. How do we remedy that? If I have a good relationship with a guy and a couple, I now become a one-on-one. It's a 2-person relationship, and we go out and have breakfast, for example, or we do something like that. Okay? How do we help a person in grief? Recognize that this social dynamic is in play, and things will change in time, but don't stop your social contact with that person just because they're only half a couple, because you'll view them as half a couple for a long, long time. Now, the new people that I've met since Janie passed doesn't view me as half a couple. They view me as my own self. But those of you that knew Janie and knew her for several years, you look at me and you can still see that I'm half a couple. And that's just the way we are. The next thing is, people say, we're going to eventually get to a new normal in grief. I hate that term. A new normal sounds like you're going to walk through a door and it's going to be a new world and it's going to be normal again. We've never had a normal period in our life. We've always been growing. We were a baby, we were a toddler, we were a child, we were a teenager, we were a young adult, we got married, we had kids, we matured, we retired. Our life has constantly changed, and it will change. But if you think about your life, you've never had normal periods one after the other. You've had new chapters of your life. And each phase of your life is a chapter. And some phases are great, and some phases are not so good. Janie and I had been in a great phase of life. We had been retired. We were doing what we wanted. We were enjoying life. And then she passed. And I stepped into a dark and painful chapter of my life. Now, I brought everything with me from the past, because that's what chapters are. That's like in a chapter book. You bring everything you've ever had in your story with you to a new chapter. And then eventually, when you get through your grief process, your grief journey, you step into the next chapter, which is a bright chapter and has joy in it. So, when a person is grieving, they tend to think this is going to be the way it is forever. And it's not. You're going to progress through this chapter and get to a new chapter. How do we help? We need to recognize that the current chapter is not the final chapter in anyone's life. We need to support them because they're transitioning. Your support will make it easier for them to navigate the dark chapter so they don't get stuck in the dark chapter and just take it on as an identity and sit there without progressing. Now, I've met people who've lost a child many years ago, and they never progressed to a new chapter. And they're still stuck where they are because they never got through that chapter and quit grieving. So, come alongside and encourage and love that person to get them to a new position. The next is we have to deal with grief. We have to walk through it. We can't hide it because it'll come back. We don't medicate it. It'll still be there. We have to embrace it. We have to allow ourselves to go to the hard places and do the hard things to deal with grief. We have to go to our favorite restaurant again. We have to look through family photos again. Even though they're going to bring us pain right now, if we keep looking through them, they will eventually get to bring us joy. We have to go to our favorite vacation spot to get closure. My family used to vacation in Switzerland. Not my family. Janie and I vacationed in Switzerland. I wanted to take my kids and grandkids there a couple of years ago. I went there first. I went everywhere, and I got closure so that I didn't get closure when I was showing the spots to my family. And we had a wonderful trip. You have to go back to church and sit in the same pew that you sat in with your spouse. You have to get closure. It's hard, but without getting the closure on each of those things, you can't progress past it because it will always be a stumbling block. Now then, there is one place that I will not go to because I don't have easy access to it, and I just can't do it, or I couldn't do it the one time. A couple of years ago, mother was taken into the hospital and through the emergency room, and they wheeled her in, and Dale and I were going to go back to join her in that room, and I turned the corner, and it was the same room that they took Janie into, and my heart just stopped, and I couldn't breathe, and I said, Dale, I just can't go in there. And I turned and I left. It was too much. Okay, the next thing, major decisions in your life. You need to postpone them until your grief is further along. Don't 3 weeks after you've lost your spouse say, I got to get out of this house, I'm going to sell it and move on. Because you may find that you have a lot of memories in that house that will help you process grief, and you really liked it, and you'll want to be there later on. It's like where I live. Janie and I designed that house. We built that house. We loved that house. And after she left, it was like, this is a big old house. But you know, I don't want to be anywhere else on earth, because that's my house, and I have too many memories built into that house. Okay? I tell people generally, don't go out and look for a new spouse to replace someone because you're just lonely and you want to talk to people. Okay? Don't look. I tell people, don't get married until grief is settled down. And there's a big exception here. Unless God puts somebody directly in your path. Sue Mingers has a beautiful testimony about how she lost her husband. And then God put Dale Mingers directly in her path and blessed that marriage. And that's the exception, is when God acts, listen to God and trust God. The next thing that people struggle with in grief over months, and it's things that you would never know that they struggle with. It's personal items. It's things like making a doctor's appointment. You need a doctor's appointment regularly while you're in the grief process because you're living in a lot of stress, and doctors need to take care of you and check you out. So you have to do that. Then in personal hygiene, you can't be lazy. You have to get up every morning, brush your teeth, take a shower, get dressed, face the day, whether you plan on going anywhere or not. You have to get a haircut. Now, I never knew how to get a haircut because Janie would say, Gale, you need to go get a haircut. Okay, I'd go get a haircut. After she passed, I didn't think about it. And finally, my neighbor, Donnie Martin, said, Gale, your hair is getting long. You need a haircut. I said, thanks, Donnie. I said, keep telling me when I need it because I don't know. So about every 6 weeks, she'd say, Gale, go get a haircut. So now I keep it on my calendar, and about every 6 weeks, I go get a haircut. Okay? Another thing is the wedding ring. That's a personal decision. It's a very personal decision. Do you wear your wedding ring or do you not wear your wedding ring? Some people take their wedding ring off early because it helps them with closure. Okay? I wore my wedding ring for about 4 years. And then I had to go into the doctor or hospital or something, it was some medical thing, and I had to take it off. So I took it off, went in. When I came home, I looked at it and I said, it's time. And I've never put it back on again. It's in a little pouch with Janie's wedding band and her wedding ring, and it's locked away in my safety deposit box. I know where it's at. It's safe. That's a personal decision. I also have something else. If you've ever been out to my house, you know that it's a very long house. The garage is on one end of the house, the master bedroom's on the other. I depended on Janie to be the ears because she would wake me up at night and said, I heard a noise. So I'd get up and I'd go check it out and come back to bed. You know, like husbands do. That's our job, I think. Okay? Well, I'm hard of hearing. So I would go to bed and I would worry because somebody could drive a bulldozer through the garage and I wouldn't hear them at night. So I've solved that. I've got a couple of alarms inside the house. I keep my bedroom door locked. And I keep a firearm on my nightstand, and sometimes it's under my pillow. I sleep very well because I feel secure now. But you have to make accommodations for things when you don't have a spouse to do the other half for you. So how can we help? We can take people out, go to a movie, have lunch, do something to make sure they get up, brush their teeth, take a shower, and get dressed in the morning. Okay? Keep a little social activity going. That helps them with personal stuff. If they really need a haircut, tell them, because they may not know. If they go in and their shirt is wrinkled or dirty or whatever, tell them, pretend that you're their spouse, and if the spouse would tell them, hey, you need to change your shirt, tell them, hey, you probably need to change your shirt, okay? Their wedding ring, that's off limits. Don't mention it, because that's personal and that's private, and when it's time to take it off, they'll take it off. And the last thing is, don't break into my house late at night unannounced unless you've made peace with God. Okay? Okay. The next thing is a temptation to isolate. People in grief will try to isolate. Okay? Isolation is like a two-edged sword. Okay? Why do people try to isolate? They're tired of telling everybody that they're doing fine. Okay? I figured out what fine meant. F-I-N-E. Frustrated, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. They're doing fine. Okay? And you're tired of telling people you're doing fine. So you just want to get away, and you're tired of acting like you're okay. Because you're not. Because no one understands. So you want to isolate as a defense mechanism. You want to get away from people. Then their world is moving awfully fast. And you're exhausted. Because it's energy sapping to be in grief. It really is. You just want peace and quiet. You want to have time to think and process and grieve and cry. So isolation is also healing. And you want to have time to talk to God. And you can't talk to God, or I say talk to God. You can't scream at God and shake your fist at God and demand questions to be answered like why. You want to feel His presence, and you can't do that unless you're alone. So you need isolation. It's necessary. But too much isolation is unhealthy. And too much isolation may be an indication that you're not recovering, that you're medicating, and you're just in comatose most of the time, sitting there. How can we help? Allow people to have personal time, but make sure they don't stay personal all the time. Watch out that they don't drop out of society. Invite them back into fellowship. Invite them back into church. Tell them you'll pick them up, or you'll meet them outside the church building and walk in together. Let them know that they have close friends that they can come to. The next thing that people in grief is they're ambushed by triggers. I mentioned some triggers last time. Anything that strikes a grief emotion is a trigger, and you can be ambushed by it. It can be sounds. It can be a song at church. That's a trigger. Even today, I can hear certain songs at church, and all of a sudden, boom, I'm crying in the back. I'm standing there, tears coming down the cheeks, but it's because it just hit my heart, and it's a trigger. It could be the sound of a car pulling in the driveway, or a door opening, or people talking in a restaurant, or country music. I had to get away completely from country music for 1 year, because 98% of all country songs talk about loss of a loved one, okay? You can't do that in grief. Okay, you'll cry your way through everything. Also, Janie and I love to go dancing to country music. And at one time, I was a round dance cuer with square dances. Y'all don't know what that is, but it was classic moves that I cued the dances to. And any of those songs that Janie and I did, those were triggers, okay? Smells can be triggers. You can go through a crowd, you can pass someone down the hallway in the church, and you can get a whiff of perfume. And if it was her perfume, it can be a trigger. You might get a whiff of pipe smoke, and that triggers. Or a shampoo fragrance. Or even smelling a rose. Janie and I had this thing about roses. We lived a couple of places, we had roses, and for like 9 months out of the year, I kept a fresh rose in the house for her every day. So a rose sometimes is a trigger for me. Sights, so a glimpse of a person in a crowd that you do a double take thinking that she's over there. You see a couple holding hands. You see a sunset. That was a trigger for me because Janie and I shared sunsets. If I'd go out and see a sunset and she wasn't home, I'd call her and say, look at the sunset. And we'd share sunsets. And then emotions are also triggers. The first laugh, you feel guilt. You feel loneliness, that triggers anxiety. You have sadness, that may trigger regret. In time, the triggers will become fewer and less frequent because your mind has begun to process that they're normal and don't necessarily trigger all the emotions. But unless you go through and you experience the triggers, you'll never get away from them. I still have triggers, and it's been 5.5 years. Dance music is a trigger. Sunsets. Talking about grief is a trigger. I will probably cry again tonight, but that's okay. My mind hasn't processed that talking about grief doesn't trigger the feeling sometimes. How can we help? Again, understand and accept. It may have been 6 months since someone lost their spouse, and you're walking with them out shopping, and they glance up and see a couple holding hands, and then all of a sudden, their eyes fill with tears and they start crying. You have no idea what triggered it. Don't criticize. Accept it, understand it, and know that when the emotions take over, they simply take over. You can't stop it. Making changes to your space. After Janie passed away, I made some changes to the house. I tell people, change your space to reflect who you are. Don't make your house a shrine. Okay? Now then, it's fine to leave Janie's closet untouched for 6 months or a year, or in the case of some people I know, 4 or 5 years, until the time is right to go into it. But don't make your house a shrine to your loved one. It's your living space. Make it your place. The first thing I did, honestly, and it was 2 months after Janie passed away, is I took out the electric cook stove in the kitchen and I threw it to the curb and I bought me a gas cook stove. Okay? I love to cook on gas. I hate electricity. Janie was afraid of gas, so we always had electricity. Well, now I've got my gas stove. Okay? I also had some collections of things that Janie just didn't care about. And she had collections of things, mostly stuffed animals, that I didn't care about. So I transitioned out. I emptied her collection of stuffed animals, and I got rid of dozens and dozens and dozens of stuffed animals, and I kept a half dozen maybe, because there were things that I liked and that did remind me of her. But I didn't need to see 50 stuffed bears to remember her. One stuffed bear would be sufficient, okay? So I got rid of those. I cleared a wall space, and I hung up my Civil War documents that I had. I have a coupon bond. I have currencies. I have a Union Cavalry officer's sword. Those are on the wall. They're my man space, as my kids like to call it, okay? I also have, hanging just above them, the wedding certificate, marriage license for my parents and both sets of grandparents. I've got the originals and have them framed and hung as well. And my kids think that's a weird mix of documents. I don't care, it's mine. It's my house. I can do with it what I want, okay? Change it up, but make it your place. Now, I do keep things around that were specifically Janie's, because I like them, and I like the memories associated with them. She did some needlepoint. They're still framed and on the wall, because I like them and I want them there. But anything that was there because she liked it and I didn't care about it, I've moved it on. I've slowly packed it away. Things that were on the shelves, I've slowly packed them away and put out what I like. I've made it my own place. Cleaning out closets. Eventually you'll clean out the closets, but don't let anyone rush you. Closets are a treasure trove for the grieving person. You can step in there and you can smell, and it brings back memories. And sometimes you need that. I miss Janie, and I miss certain aspects. I miss her voice. I found a couple of recordings of her voice, one on an answering machine. Okay, I've kept that because I like to listen to it occasionally and hear her voice. I like to smell her smell. I like to see some clothes and remember that she wore those clothes, and I recognize when and where she wore them, and they were all good times. When you do get around to cleaning out a closet, don't just throw away the stuff. Consider this. I made some quilts out of Janie's clothing. And it's a memory quilt, and I sleep under it occasionally because it feels good. Okay? I took Janie's flannel shirts. She loved flannel shirts. And I made book bags for my kids and grandkids and myself out of those flannel shirts. And each book bag has the front pockets and buttons and everything, so you can tell what it is, and it was her shirts, and I kept the one for me that I recognized the most. And those are good memory things. How can we help people? Don't rush them and tell them they need to clean out the closet. But when they get to the point of saying, it's time, it feels right, I need to clean out the closet, jump in and help them so they don't get bogged down. Box the things up. Sort the things out. If they want to make a memory quilt, they'll say, I want these things in the quilt, so put them to the side and pack up the other stuff to give to a charity. Don't give it to Goodwill, okay? Goodwill goes through it, hangs it back up on a rack and sells it. They're strictly profit-making. Give it to a charity that can use the clothing, okay? But help them, don't hinder them. The next thing is household chores. Very often, if there's someone, a loved one's passed away, people will think, oh, you don't have your husband anymore. You must have lots of free time. Why don't we go out and do some shopping? Well, unless your husband was a couch potato, or unless your wife was a couch potato, You two work together to clean the house, to do the laundry, to shop, to prepare meals, to do yard work, to do everything, home maintenance, everything around the house. And now one person's doing the work of two. You don't have more free time, you have less free time, and people don't understand that because you're busy trying to take up the slack of what your spouse used to do. Get some help. Rearrange your priorities and see what you can do. For me, my neighbor, James Martin, I love the Martins, by the way, if you can't tell. James Martin mows my yard for me. He and I went in together. I bought a big zero radius turn, whatever, lawnmower, big expensive thing. And he rides it like a toy. He mows my yard, his yard, Dale's yard, Mother's yard. Anytime they need mowing, he's out there mowing yards. He loves that. But I don't have to get out and worry and mow the yard. He takes care of it. He also watches for maintenance items around my house. He'll say, Gale, you've got some paint peeling over here. We need to take care of that. Or he said, Gale, your light's out on the back. We need to fix it. And he'll get the bulb and he'll get up and fix it. Okay? He'll watch for things that need to be done around my house, and he'll do them. Get some help. I also hired a housekeeper. She comes in every 2 weeks. It keeps me on schedule because I pull the sheets off my bed and wash them every 2 weeks instead of forgetting them for months at a time because I really don't care. But she keeps me on time. So how can we help? Understand that the people grieving are busier than they've ever been before, and they don't have time just to drop and go out and spend a day with whatever. They need to plan it a little bit. But keep going out with them. Maybe make it short visits. Make it just a lunch instead of a lunch and a whole afternoon. Do that. The next item is cooking. Cooking is a big issue for a person that's grieving. Initially, nothing tastes good, and you really don't want to do it, and you're tired, and it takes effort, so it's easier to get a bowl of cereal. Now, I loved cooking for Janie and myself. I would make us some great meals. I really would. I hate cooking for myself. I hate it. Why spend 30 minutes prepping a meal that I'm going to eat in 10 minutes and forget about and not care about? And that's a big issue. I have to learn to shop for one person, which is a big thing. I can't go in and get a bunch of 10 bananas because they'll go bad before I get through them. I don't buy bread because I don't eat but 3 slices before the loaf is gone. So I've learned to eat things that keep longer and I can buy in smaller quantities. I'll go in and I'll buy 3 bananas, I'll buy 2 squash, I'll buy 1 onion, I might buy 1 sweet potato. It takes a different mentality to cook for one. I find that frozen foods are easier because I can open a bag and take out a 3/4 of a cup of mixed vegetables, put it back in the freezer. So I can take out 1 serving, okay? How to help? I love this one. Invite them out for dinner sometime. It's a meal they don't have to prepare, they don't have to think about, and they can just have dinner. It doesn't matter. Go to a pizza place and let them eat a piece of pizza. That's fine. You get to talk with them, you get to visit with them, and they don't have to eat. What's my favorite meal? Anything I don't have to cook. Okay? That's my favorite meal. For years now, James and Donnie have had me over at their house, or they come to my house, and we have dinner together about 3 times a week. And it's not fancy. When they come over, And I had them over a couple of nights. I had them over Monday night, actually. They came in. I'll be honest with everybody. If you don't know me, this has been a new revelation, but I like to drink wine with somebody. I'd never drink it by myself. But they came into my house. Janie went into the wine cupboard and she grabbed a bottle of wine. James went out to the freezer and he pulled out 2 frozen pizzas. I turned the oven on and we fixed dinner and sat down and ate and talked for an hour. That's my kind of dinner. With people, something I don't have to fix. Okay. How can we help? If we're grilling, grill a little bit extra and take it to them. If you're cooking a roast, cook a little bit bigger roast, cut off part, and take it to them. Help the grieving person out with a little something they don't have to cook, and they can make a meal or two on. Photographs of your loved one. When a person goes through grief, they memorize every photograph they've ever had of their grieving person over time. Because at first it's painful, and then it's a source of comfort, and then you want to see your loved one again. I have memorized every picture that I've ever seen of Janie. And then once in a while, someone will come to me and say, hey, they were going through some old pictures, and here's a picture of Janie at a Christmas party at Couples 2, and will give me a new picture. And that's like a treasure, because it's a new view of her that I haven't memorized already. So help them out. If you have pictures of their loved one, let them have pictures. 2 more items or whatever, and we're through. I've talked a long time tonight. Dates, holidays, anniversaries, birthdays. The first year, and sometimes the second year, all the major dates are excruciatingly painful. Janie's first birthday after she passed March 2nd. Her birthday is May 18th. Was painful because she loved birthdays, and she'd celebrate, and it was a birth month. Okay, that's how she always described it. And her first birthday without her there, my girls and I were on the phone to each other just crying because they missed her so much. She came alive on her birthday. She was happy. She was just joy wrapped up in a bundle on her birthday. And there was no joy in my world. The first Easter, Thanksgiving, Christmas, or Valentine's are all terrible. We'll get to the major holidays next week. The first wedding anniversary is terrible. The first anniversary of your loved one's death is an emotional nightmare because you remember it like it was yesterday. Now, Janie and my girls and I, on our first anniversary of Janie's death, we had a traumatic experience. Janie had a stroke on February 28th. She was in the hospital on the March 1st. The girls flew in, and I pulled the plug on March 2nd and let her go, let her pass. Okay? The first anniversary was a leap year. We had a February 29th stuck in there, and we didn't know how to process it mentally of her having a stroke on the 28th, and then the first and the second. We also had an extra day, and that was traumatic. I will say this: focus on the birthdays, the wedding anniversaries, all the holidays that were special to your loved one, but skip focusing on the day they died. That's one anniversary you don't need to carry around. In time, all the others will become to joy. But that one will never turn joyous. Let it go. Don't count it. Let it fade by the wayside. How can we help? We can communicate. We can drop someone a note and say, hey, it's Janie's birthday next week. I was just thinking about her. Hope you have a good time. Or send her another note and say, hey, Janie loved Halloween. I remember that. Happy Halloween. Just make it positive. Don't send a note. Hey, I remember it's the anniversary of when Janie died. That's a downer. Skip that note. If you see the person on that anniversary date, say, this might be a tough day for you. How are you doing today? You're in my prayers. And just let it go. The next thing I want to talk about is, has anyone noticed my friend? Who is my friend? He's the elephant in the room. Every person in grief has an elephant in the room. And do you know who he is? For me, he's Gale Lawler. It's her name. Janie died March 2nd. After about the 1st of April of that year, 2015, I have not heard her name mentioned by anybody in this church more than a dozen times in 5.5 years. I'm not blaming people in the church. I'm just saying this is how our society works. We want to protect the person grieving so we don't mention their loved one. We don't call their name. Now then, there's an old saying that the sweetest sound in any language is the sound of a person's name. Okay? If I would say Butch would smile. He said, he's talking to me. If I'd say Margie's ears would perk up. If I'd say Jared would perk up because he would hear his name. Okay? You can whisper Gale in the back of the room and I'll hear it and I'll perk up. But the sweetest sound, the second sweetest sound, is the name of your loved one. And for healing, sometimes you need it. Now, people are courteous and don't want to hurt you, don't want to embarrass you, don't want to cause you pain, so they don't say it. But that's just an error. When a person's grieving, talk to them about their loved one and tell a funny story. Tell a positive thing that happened. Don't say, oh, I'm so sorry that Janie died. No, forget that. Say, do you remember that time that Janie was working out in the food pantry and it was raining and she didn't care? She just went outside and was singing along, pushing the baskets. Okay? Or do you remember that time that Janie did thus and so? Tell a funny story. But say their name. Because that's healing to the grieving person, because the grieving person recognizes that their memory still exists and people still care and people found joy in their loved one. And that's important. But that's the elephant in the room for every person in grief. Finally, let's talk about the end of the grief journey. Grief is a dark, hard chapter in your life. But someday, it will pass and you will enjoy a new chapter, one that's brighter with joy in it. And how do you know when your journey ends? I'm not sure a grief journey ever ends. Mine has not. But the bad days will be fewer and further apart. The memories will become sweeter with less sadness. At some point, the memory of your loved one will bring you joy. You will always miss them. You will always love them. You will always think of them, and they will always be a part of you. But they will reside in a previous chapter of your life. It's like your childhood. You can look back and have good memories of your childhood. Someday you can look back and have good memories of your loved one without sadness and without grief. But now you live in a new chapter, one that's brighter and contains joy. How is Gale Lawler doing? I live in a bright new chapter in my life. I miss Janie, and I still grieve from time to time. But I have found joy again. Brother Jared, do you want to close us? Tonight I have a handout. It's called The Care and Feeding of Your Grieving Person. It has some cute guidelines. I'm going to pass these out and ask you to hang on to them so that you can review them from time to time and remember what to do.
All right, thank you, Gale, for sharing your story and about Miss Janie, and pray that his story, and just as he walked that path, that relates to you in a situation either you're going through, you've been through, or you know someone else that's going through. And so let's go to the Lord in prayer, and we will wrap it up tonight. Gracious Father, thank you for your love and your mercy. Thank you that you are near to the brokenhearted. You bear our griefs and our sorrows, and you bring redemption and restoration and healing. And so, Father, I pray that tonight, those listening in this room, those listening online, that you would work through this service tonight, work through the stories, the teachings of Brother Gale and his story. Father, I pray you'd use that to encourage our hearts, to strengthen us as we walk this path. But, Lord, we love you, and we're thankful for your grace and your mercy. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so I'm sure you can come get these handouts he's got up here for you.